Whoop. Oh, okay. And now, good evening, everyone. Greetings from beautiful downtown Catskill, New York. I am on a road trip, visiting friends upstate. And as you can see, even though the location has changed, the fact that I'm on the road has not stopped me from making sure I am here to spend this time with you for our Bhagavad-gita satsang. So thank you very much for being here with me. As is our usual habit, yes, please raise your hand in order to let me know that you can hear the words that are emanating from my mouth. Thank you very much, one and all. You can put your hands down. Thank you for letting me know that I'm really there. And I am excited to see you as well. Thank you so very much for being here. As is our usual habit, I'll give you a quick rundown of what's going to happen this evening. So we already know how to raise hands. You can adjust your audio settings and your viewing options up in the upper right-hand corner. You need not worry about your microphone or your video camera because you can see and hear me, but I cannot see or hear you. I have already gotten a question, or not so much a question, but a statement in the Q&A box. So thank you very much for that. I assume now that that is working for everyone. So we will proceed. Last week, we came just about all the way around into the end of this chapter, a summation of knowledge of sacrifice. We spoke about the traditional manner in which knowledge of sacrifice is obtained, namely by approaching someone who is a seer of the truth with an attitude of submission, and submissive inquiry specifically, and service. And the nature of the relationship is those who have seen the truth are naturally inclined to impart the truth to one engaged in such a relationship. We also spoke about the results of knowledge and the alternatives to knowledge. We're going to revisit some of these verses as we move through a review of the entire chapter tonight, culminating in the final two verses, verses 41 and 42. So without further ado, I am going to proceed through the chapter more or less from the beginning, hitting on a few highlights, and also looking at some of the verses that we've spoken about, but from a little different angle, hopefully casting a little extra insight into some of the verses that we highlighted during the course of reviewing this chapter. In general, what's happening in this chapter is Krishna is giving Arjuna instruction on how he can become free from the reactions to his actions by making his actions an act of sacrifice. And the key to making this work, to achieving this freedom, is to understand that the purpose of this sacrifice is to attain transcendental knowledge. So the idea here is that action performed without attachment to the results of action results in realization, spiritual realization. And it may not look on the face of it as if that even makes sense, but this is the mystical process of yoga. Action offered as a sacrifice, performed with knowledge that the ultimate purpose of the sacrifice is in fact the realization of transcendental knowledge, is karma yoga. And because it's karma yoga, it means freedom from karma, freedom from reaction. So now let's look at a few of these verses in a little more detail. In the second verse of the chapter, Krishna tells Arjuna, after having given some of the history of the Gita, he opens the chapter by explaining that the same science of yoga that Arjuna is hearing was also heard from Krishna by Vivishwan, the deity in charge of the sun, who then instructed his son, and so on and so forth. Then, the next verse, visionary kings thus understood this supreme science through a chain of disciplic succession. In the course of time, this succession was broken, and thus this science of yoga has been lost. So there are two takeaways from this verse. One, who is the Gita intended for? Who is the recipient of this science of yoga? Visionary kings. In other words, the Bhagavad-gita is a book of knowledge for leaders of society. In this way, the Gita has a similarity to the Tao Te King, Lao Tzu's book of wisdom, is also meant for leaders of society. As opposed to, for example, the Yoga Sutras, which is a treatise of yoga for renunciates, people who have turned their back on the world, as opposed to people who are charged, whose duty is to give protection to the citizens of the world. If you're a kshatriya or a warrior, the ruling class, let's say, then your conditional dharma, the nature of the sacrifice that you are going to perform, is the sacrifice of giving protection to social order and to the members of society operating within that order. And this is the sacrifice that Krishna is urging Arjuna to make, the sacrifice that's suitable for his particular position in society, and therefore his dharma, the proper way for Arjuna to respond to his destiny is to perform the sacrifice of protecting righteousness, justice, etc. We often think of the Gita as either being a religious text or a text of social duty, or a text of yoga. We don't necessarily think that a text about yoga or about how to respond to one's destiny is necessarily for politicians, for government leaders. But here, Krishna says exactly this, that the audience, the intended audience for the Bhagavad-gita are the leaders of society. So that means you are a leader of society because you are hearing the Bhagavad-gita. I'll elaborate on that as we go along. The other interesting thing is that Krishna says, in due course of time, due to the influence of time, this knowledge was scattered. The system through which this knowledge was meant to be disseminated was lost. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. Later, in the 11th chapter, Krishna will reveal that he himself is time. That time is an energy of his that he appears within. So there's a certain non-duality between the energy and the source of the energy. Krishna declares directly, I am time, and I appear in the world as time, which makes sense. If Krishna is the supreme being, then the supreme insurmountable element in the material world is time. So in this way, we see that Krishna actually is the source of transcendental knowledge, the original teacher of the ancients, once again, correlating to the position of Ishvara in the Yoga Sutras. So he's responsible for the dissemination and continuance of the yoga tradition and yoga, transcendental knowledge in yoga, but he is also involved in the disruption of the lineage. He's also involved in the scattering of that knowledge, and therefore creates the need for him to appear once again to reinstate it, to reestablish it. And he gives that as a reason for his appearance, to reestablish these teachings. Whenever they are lost, he shows up. Just kind of a curious element here about how Krishna is involved in both the origination of these teachings and in their dispersion from time to time. In the following verse, text 3, Krishna tells Arjuna, "Today I am teaching you this same ancient science of yoga. I am revealing this transcendental mystery to you because you are my devotee as well as my friend." So here, Krishna has given an indication as to what is the qualification for receiving this divine revelation. It's divine revelation because it is coming from Krishna directly. And that qualification for receiving and understanding this revelation is devotion. A mood of friendship with the source of this transcendental knowledge. This verse is actually the first verse in the Bhagavad-gita where the word bhakti, or devotion, appears. And from this point forward, Krishna will actually continue to develop this theme of devotion as being the principal means by which transcendental knowledge is arrived at. Okay. Here's also something else that I think we can get from this verse. The idea that the message is more than the cultural context within which the message appears. Every spiritual tradition has an ongoing need for periodic renovation. The principle of devotion shows up in every spiritual tradition, and every spiritual tradition occasionally needs some renovation so that it is once again relevant to the time, place, and circumstance in which that revelation is appearing. Somehow or other, over the course of time, it gets stale and therefore needs to be renovated. And the consistent element, irrespective of how the details are tweaked according to time, place, and circumstance, is this element of devotion. So the Bhagavad-gita has a cultural context that it's associated with, and yet the message of the Gita transcends that cultural context. It's not specific. And in a sense, you can say that the message is more than the medium in this case. Verses 5 through 14 are considered to be seed verses for chapters 7 through 12. Chapters 7 through 12 are the chapters that are generally recognized as specifically being about bhakti yoga, as opposed to karma yoga and raja yoga, which are the topics in this first section of the Gita. As we move through chapters 5 and into chapter 6, we will transition from karma yoga into Raja Yoga, or Patanjali's eightfold mystic yoga system. These verses are considered seed verses for the entire section that is specifically about bhakti, because Krishna is revealing things about himself that indicate his position as the object of devotion, as the person to whom devotion is intended to be offered. For example, in verse 9, Krishna says, "O Arjuna, one who knows the truth about the transcendental nature of my appearance and activities does not, upon leaving their body, take birth again in this material world. They come to me instead." So here, Krishna is introducing the general principle of an avatar, one who descends for the sake of delivering a transcendental message. And the message here is simply by understanding Krishna's position, that his appearance is not mundane, is enough to achieve not only liberation, but Krishna's eternal association. And this is now a point of confusion for Arjuna at the start of this chapter, because it appears as if Krishna appears in a point in time to Arjuna. After all, Krishna is Arjuna's cousin. And they've known each other for all this time in terms of their family relationship and friendship. So it appears as if Krishna shows up in the world just like anybody else. And he has a uniquely beautiful appearance, and his complexion is different from everyone else. And yet still, somehow or other, not everyone recognizes that his form is unlike everyone else's form. Here, he makes it clear that he does not appear in a material body as a result of a reaction to past karma, but rather he appears in his own transcendental form by his own free will. He's not obliged. In this section, he goes on about how no action affects him. That is to say, nothing anyone else does affects him, nor do his own actions generate any reaction that he is obliged to experience. And therefore, his own appearance in the world is not by some karmic obligation. So this again corresponds to Patanjali's description of Ishvara as someone who does not experience any karmic reactions, nor do they have any psychological predispositions by virtue of karma. Then so let me just check in right here. Do any of you have any questions about what we've spoken about in our review thus far, insofar as the purpose of sacrifice and Krishna's position in relationship to karma, action and reaction. If you have any question, go ahead and pop it into the Q&A. I will see it there and I will get to it promptly. Meanwhile, I will finish up this portion of our review with the 11th verse and then 14 and 15. So in the 11th verse, Krishna continues, however one approaches me, I respond to them in just that way. Everyone in all circumstances follows my path, O son of Pritha. Oftentimes when I speak about yoga philosophy and the different possible angles of yoga philosophy, different schools of yoga philosophy, the different ways that different schools look at the same thing, or even other philosophies outside of yoga philosophy. One of the things I like to emphasize is the idea of the unspoken premise in a statement, which is to say, look for that which is assumed by a question or an argument, a philosophical argument, and decide whether or not you accept the unspoken premise, or if there is some significance in the unspoken assumption with regard to this particular question or claim. And here, when Krishna says, however one approaches me, I respond to them in just that way. I reciprocate with them in precisely that way. The assumption that he's making is that anyone can approach Krishna. Anyone can approach him. And in fact, everyone may be approaching Krishna, and not everyone knows it, because not everyone is cognizant of an ultimate divine power that is the ultimate source of everything. So whatever one may be pursuing, the ultimate source of whatever that is the Supreme Person. And people may have any number of different desires they wish to fulfill, and any number of ways that they may seek to fulfill that desire. Whatever it is one wants, and whatever way one wants to try to fulfill that desire, everyone is ultimately approaching Krishna, the Supreme Being, or if they are intent on avoiding the Supreme Person, then they are moving away from the Supreme Person, except you really can't do that because the Supreme Person by definition is present everywhere, all pervading. Vasudeva is a name that indicates the all-pervading transcendence. So Vasudeva is used in the mantra, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, Om, indicating the absolute reality, Namo, offering respects to, Bhagavate, unto Bhagavan, as in Sri Bhagavan Uvacha, Krishna speaks, that person who has all qualities in infinite quantity and absolute perfection, Vasudevaya, unto that person who is all-pervading, located everywhere. So there's really nowhere you can go, no direction that you can move in that takes you away from Krishna. In the Sri Isha Upanishad, the Upanishad about Ishvara, the Supreme Person is described in a variety of paradoxical ways, such as he is swifter than the mind and can outrun anybody. Well, where's he going to run to? He's already everywhere. And yet, Krishna is described as having a form, or Vishnu, also the expansions of the Supreme Being that perform various functions through the Vishnu incarnations are all described as having forms. So how can someone or something that is all-pervading also be local? How can someone who's everywhere go anywhere? And yet, here is Krishna, who has gone to the battlefield of Kurukshetra to drive the chariot for his friend Arjuna. So these are paradoxes as opposed to contradictions, because the Supreme Person is not limited to being either all-pervading and formless, or having a form and having to go somewhere in order to get there. So the point here is that not only can one say that wherever you go, there you are, but you also have to say wherever you go, there is Krishna also. And it's really just a question of in what way are you approaching Krishna? So this verse can be seen as an invitation from Krishna to approach him. And if one desires to understand spiritual knowledge, then approaching Krishna in a mood of friendship, as we have already established, is the way to go. There are two categories of spiritual knowledge. Category number one, knowledge of the spiritual nature of the self. Category number two, knowledge of the transcendental nature of Krishna, or the Supreme Person. And if you want to understand those two different categories of spiritual knowledge, then approaching Krishna in a favorable, friendly mood is the way to do it, because then Krishna says right here, I will respond to them in just that way. So this is an invitation. And once again, an indication that that invitation transcends cultural context. However one approaches me, in any way. So one does not have to practice any particular set of rituals, follow any particular set of religious dogma or anything like that. However one approaches me. As we get into the chapter a little bit later, there will be a recommended process. And finishing this section, these seed verses for the section on Bhakti Yoga, chapter 7 through 12, 14 and 15 of this chapter, Krishna says, no action adheres to me, nor do I aspire for the fruits of action. Think of it like this. Rain falls from the sky and nourishes plants that give fruits and vegetables. The rain does not derive any benefit from helping these fruits and vegetables grow. So similar, and it has nothing to gain. Rain has nothing to gain by fruits and vegetables growing on plants. The rain is independent. So similarly, Krishna is actually always engaged in service, serving us, providing everything that we need, like rain and sunshine and earth and vegetables that grow on plants, that sort of thing. And yet, the Supreme Being has nothing in particular to gain by any of this. It's just, you could say, causeless generosity. And this idea of sacrifice, of offering that which is given back to the source, is completing a cycle in a relationship. The precise phrase that Hridayananda Das Goswami likes to use in his talks and translation of the Bhagavad-gita is a wheel is made to turn. So, and this very word chakra is used in this description earlier in the 3rd chapter. That it completes a cycle. A gift is given, a gift is offered back, and that way there's a reciprocal relationship as opposed to a gift is given and just taken without any expression of gratitude or acknowledgement. For example, if someone gives you a bowl of cherries, then if you just say, oh, gee, thanks, and you eat all the cherries, that's rude, actually. The first thing one who really feels gratitude for having received a bowl of cherries is you offer the person who gave you the bowl of cherries a cherry. Would you like one? So, life's a bowl of cherries. Okay, so one who understands this idea that Krishna is not affected by action, doesn't aspire to any fruits of action, doesn't have anything to gain by this. One who understands that truth about me is freed from the entanglements of reactions to fruitive work. So this is where knowledge of spiritual knowledge in the category of the Supreme Being comes into play. That knowledge itself is liberating. So throughout this whole chapter, what we've seen is that the actual liberating principle of sacrifice is knowledge. Knowledge of the intention of the sacrifice, knowledge of the ultimate recipient of the sacrifice, and then the actual fruit. When one gives up the material fruit, when one is cultivating detachment from the results of one's actions for oneself, then the result you do get is realized knowledge, direct experiential understanding of transcendental knowledge. So the fruit of sacrifice is transcendental knowledge, whereas the fruit of work is karmic reaction. So there's your tweetable for this session. Indeed, the sages of ancient times attained liberation by acting with this understanding. Therefore, you should act as the ancients did, following in their footsteps. So here, Krishna now is reflecting back on the very first verse of the chapter when he taught the ancient demigod Vivishwan at the beginning of the creation of the universe. So here he's indicating the antiquity of this knowledge that precedes his speaking it to Arjuna. We often say yoga is a 5,000-year-old science or practice. And here, if we accept that the Bhagavad-gita was spoken or recorded 5,000 years ago, let's just say, for argument's sake, that we accept that. Well, what Krishna is saying is, long before I spoke to you, Arjuna, I spoke to the ancient Raja Rishis, enlightened kings. And that itself can have a broad definition of not only someone who is a ruler in this literal sense, but also Raja Rishi means a wise person who is in complete control of their senses due to the practice of yoga. In either case, just as Patanjali is presenting a systematic, organized way of understanding and practicing yoga in his Yoga Sutras, he says, I'm presenting this, I didn't make this stuff up. It's understood that it's a pre-existing science. Similarly, Arjuna is receiving something 5,000 years ago that precedes his reception of it. So yoga is actually eternal. It's not just a 5,000-year-old practice, even if you accept that kind of dating. According to the yoga wisdom texts themselves, this is transcendental knowledge, therefore eternal. Spiritual knowledge is spiritual, therefore it is also eternal and not something that comes into being at a point in time. And we are advised, rather than making stuff up ourselves or speculating about how to do this, we are advised to follow in the footsteps of those who have gone before us, because one of the functions of a yoga wisdom text is that it gives us the information we need in order to recreate the revelatory experience described in these wisdom texts. So if we follow in the footsteps of the people who have received and acted properly on this information in the past, we can recreate that same experience for ourselves. Okay. Then, in the next section, Krishna describes the challenge of understanding action. It's actually quite bewildering to understand what is a moral action, what is an immoral action, and what is a transcendental action. So here's another way to understand this. A moral action is an action that is in harmony with reality. For example, if you walk into a house, you're going to walk in through the door, because that's the reality of how the house is made, is that that's how you get into the house. If, on the other hand, you try to enter the house by walking through the wall, you are acting in either ignorance of or defiance of reality. And the only result is you're going to hurt yourself. The more you try to go through the wall, and if you try harder and harder and harder to go through the wall, you're just going to bang yourself up. So that's what bad karma is. Bad karma, or immoral action, is action that is performed either in defiance of or in ignorance of reality. The reality is, there's a door. You go through the door if you want to get in the house. If you try to go through the wall and you keep trying, you're just going to hurt yourself. So acclimating yourself to reality or conforming your actions to reality are going to get you a good result. Acting in defiance or ignorance of reality is going to get you a negative result. That's a simple way to understand it. Better still is to act in such a way as to transcend both good and bad karma, which is to say, think outside the box. The house you're trying to get into, what you'll find inside isn't nearly as good as something beyond that house, namely the spiritual house. Okay. Then we skip up to verse 24. In such acts of sacrifice, the instrument by which the offering is made, the act of offering, the offering itself, the one who makes the offering, and the fire that consumes the offering are all of the same spiritual nature. Thus, one who is absorbed in perfect meditation on such spiritual actions attains perfect spiritual consciousness. So this is how we understand non-duality. If we have a spiritual intention, and we engage various instruments in pursuit of a action with a spiritual intention, then the instruments themselves are experienced as spiritual. The thing that we're offering is spiritualized. The person who is offering it becomes spiritualized. Everything involved in a spiritual activity becomes spiritualized. And this is how we see matter regain its original spiritual quality. Remember that the material world is created as a result of a transformation of spiritual energies. Everything is ultimately, originally spiritual, and everything regains its spiritual quality, including us, by an engagement in sacrifice with the right state of mind, which is to say meditation on the act of sacrifice in relationship to its intended purpose of transcendental knowledge. Then skipping up to verse 34, the recommended method to understand what sacrifice is for and how to perform it, by approaching a spiritual master with humility, offering service, and making relevant inquiries. You can learn the truth about these sacrifices. They will impart this knowledge unto you, for they are seers of the truth. Now, there are a lot of words for truth in Sanskrit, but the word Krishna chooses here is tattva. Tattva means something that has standing as a real thing, a component of reality that cannot be extracted, an integral part of reality. And as I mentioned earlier, there are two integral parts of reality, us and the Supreme Person, Krishna. So if we want to understand tattva, or truth, or reality, and the integral parts of reality that simply cannot be taken away, then we approach someone who has gained expertise in these sacrifices so that we can receive guidance as to how we, in particular, based on our particular psychology, our social position, our karma, how do we take the karma that we've got and use it in acts of sacrifice in such a way so that our karma gets burned up and everything involved in the sacrifice is spiritualized. You find out from someone who actually has seen the truth by virtue of having successfully executed such sacrifices themselves and is therefore expert in guiding others. And then we wrap it up. We wrap up our review with, upon acquiring such wisdom, one quickly attains the supreme peace, whereas the doubtful do not find happiness in this world, nor do they find it in the next. So this is Krishna's recommended method for quickly finding peace in the world. And when we think about it, everyone is already engaged in an act of sacrifice. It's just a question of what is the purpose of that sacrifice. So give some thought to this. Who are you sacrificing for? What is the nature of your sacrifice? And why are you doing it? This could be your job, your school. You can be sacrificing for the sake of your family, or for the sake of your country, or for the sake of so many things. But everyone always is engaged in some act of sacrifice because it is actually our eternal dharma, our sanatana dharma, our nature. It's intrinsic in our nature to be engaged in some kind of service, to be offering something to someone. So, something to consider. Any questions about our review of the 4th chapter? Please go ahead and type any question that you may have in the question box, and we will take up your question. And while I wait anxiously for your questions, we can go to the last 2 verses of this chapter, which wrap everything up and also foreshadow what's going to happen in the 5th chapter. So, verse 41, Krishna speaking, O conqueror of riches, one who renounces the fruits of action in accordance with the principles of sacrifice, whose doubts have been severed by transcendental knowledge, and who has thus regained the composure of self-reflection, is not bound by reactions to actions. So here, it sounds as if Krishna is telling Arjuna, renounce action in accordance with principles of sacrifice. And that one whose doubts about the renunciation of action has been severed by transcendental knowledge and has thus regained the composure of self-reflection. So this, again, is this same kind of sense of yoga of, another way to put this is, one who is experiencing the true nature of the self. Remember, this is why you practice yoga in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. Yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. Why do you want to still the fluctuations of the mind? Because then you'll be able to see the true nature of the self reflected in the calm pool of the steady mind. This is the same thing. Regaining the composure of self-reflection means that because one is experiencing peace in one's mind, one therefore can experience the self as the self truly is, in the self's true nature. Therefore, the composure of self-reflection means you see the self reflected in the peaceful mind that is brought about by virtue of the renunciation of the fruits of action in accordance with the principles of sacrifice. And such a person is freed from karmic reactions, burned up. Okay, Elisa has a question. How is TM related to these teachings? So transcendental meditation, by which I assume you are specifically referring to the form of transcendental meditation taught by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and therefore is known by that name, transcendental meditation specifically. Now, I am not a follower of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and I've never actually been trained in his particular system of transcendental meditation. So I really can't speak to his specific system in an authoritative way. My knowledge of it is only secondhand, which is I understood that he gave people secret mantras, that is, you don't share your mantra with anybody else. And the same principle of mantra meditation is there. However, I don't know enough about his particular system to be able to say, well, here's how it works in relationship to what Krishna is teaching here in terms of meditation on the spiritual nature of everything involved in an act of sacrifice. So unfortunately, I can't authoritatively answer your question right now. However, I will make a note of your question and do some homework by asking those who have engaged in training in transcendental meditation. And Elisa, if that's you, if you have actually done the training, then you would be the first person that I would want to speak to about that. So if you don't mind, I might follow up with you in order to arrive at a proper answer to your question. It's probably going to require a little more dialogue than we actually have the opportunity for in the Q&A box while we're actually doing the webinar. But please let me know if I can follow up with you on this. And if you have not done that training, then I will talk to someone who has and specifically ask them about this chapter in relationship to TM and get back to you with an answer. Okay, great. Elisa, thank you very much. Look forward to hearing from me, and we can follow up together and then share our dialogue and the results of that dialogue with our satsang community. So thank you very, very much for your question and for letting me follow up with you. All righty. And if only I had a pen. That would be so nice if I had a pen. Because that way I can write this down. I have a memory like a colander. So, you know, if I don't write this down right now, who knows? This is my karma, to have a memory like a colander. And we have the last verse coming up, which now I'm going to put back up on the screen so that we can chant this verse. Oh, look, it's a pen. This is so awesome. Wow. I have mystic powers. I can just generate a pen out of thin air. You too can have mystic powers if you practice the art of sacrifice in the Bhagavad-gita. Okay, now we don't have to rely on my memory, and I assure you that is what is best for everyone concerned. All right, here we go. So this is the final verse of this chapter. I will chant, and then you can chant back. So I'll chant one line at a time. The bars across the vowels, if you have not seen these diacritical marks before, means a very open, elongated vowel sound. The tilde over the N indicates a nya sound. And when it shows up after a J, then rather than a soft J sound, you get more of a G, yeah sound. Dots under H's at the end of a word at the end of a line means we're going to echo the vowel back, the vowel that precedes the H back. Dots under S's are SH sounds. So here we go. Tasmada jnana sambhutam hritstam jnana sinatmanaha Chitvainam samshayam yogam atishta tishta bharata and the translation. Therefore, O descendant of Bharat, you should slash the doubts that have arisen in your heart due to ignorance with the sword of knowledge, armed with yoga, stand and fight. So, it sounds to Arjuna, this, by the way, is one of my favorite verses in the Bhagavad-gita, particularly that last phrase, armed with yoga, stand and fight, indicating that yoga is active, not a turning away from the world, but rather an engagement with the world from a position of empowerment. So this is a little confusing, however, for Arjuna, because it sounds to Arjuna that Krishna just said, renunciation of action is the way to go. Therefore, you should get up and do something. This verse also has an interesting aspect insofar as it tells us where our doubts are hiding. Our doubts about whether this knowledge is really real, whether we can actually do what Krishna is advising us to attempt. Our doubts about whether it'll work if we try, if it'll be a good investment of our time. These are all doubts that arise within the heart and are planted there due to avidya, ignorance, not being able to see things as they actually are, not really wrapping our heads around reality. which makes us try to walk through walls instead of come in through the door. So when we think of yoga as a process of purifying the heart, what's getting purified, among other things, are our doubts. What's being purified actually is the source of the doubts, our ignorance. All right. So this is how Krishna wraps up this chapter. An explanation of the entanglement of how we become free from the entanglement of our karma through acts of sacrifice, knowledge of different kinds of sacrifices, and how everything is spiritualized when a sacrifice is performed with transcendental knowledge as its intention, and that's actually the result. And that the actual real key to freedom, the simple and most direct key to freedom from karmic reactions, is to simply understand Krishna's position as being transcendental to karmic reactions, being untouched by any action that anyone performs, including Krishna himself. So that wraps up our chapter. If you have any questions, now's a good time to pop them into the Q&A box. If you want to ask me questions after the fact, or if you have listened to or watched this webinar class after the fact, Hari@Hari-kirtana.com is a place to send me your questions and comments. While I wait anxiously for any additional questions you may have, I will let you know that the reason I'm up here in Catskill, aside from visiting friends over the weekend, is I will be at Yoga Mandali in Saratoga Springs for integrating yoga philosophy into classes and workshops. This is a workshop for yoga teachers. So if you're a yoga teacher up in the Saratoga Springs, Albany area, please join me for this. And in case you missed the future of the yoga teacher panel discussion, you didn't miss it. Due to unexpected circumstances, we pushed it back a week. August 22nd now is the date for that panel discussion. That will be at 10 a.m. And go to embodiedphilosophy.com/future in order to reserve your spot for that panel discussion. We are also extending the deadline for registration in my advanced yoga teacher training program. This is a 300-hour program. We got two spots left. And just because I'm such a nice guy, I have extended the registration time so you still have an opportunity to sign up if you so desire. Okay. Next week, Arjuna hears Krishna say, "Renounce actions, therefore get up and fight." Arjuna still doesn't get it. If you still don't get it, don't worry, Arjuna still doesn't get it either. Krishna will now speak about the integration of action and knowledge, putting renunciation and action together through analysis and practice. And as I said, we will start to segue into the yoga system of Patanjali, the eightfold mystic yoga system. We will cover verses 1 through 7 next week. And next week I will be sitting with a more familiar background. I will be back in Washington, D.C. And it won't matter because you can watch this wherever you are, anywhere in the world. All right. I see no further questions. Therefore, I will bid you adieu from beautiful downtown Catskill, New York. I thank you very, very much for being here with me this evening. And if you have any questions after the fact, I very much look forward to taking them up with you. And Elisa, I will certainly be in contact with you soon with regard to transcendental meditation. All right. Have a wonderful rest of your week and a wonderful weekend. I look forward to seeing you next time. Okay. And meeting for all.